This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. Brian from Wisconsin is going to start us off with the question. The 1348 Black Plague supposedly killed a third to half of the population in some parts of Europe. It continued to recur for hundreds of years, and then it pretty much stopped. So, did people who survived simply evolve to be less susceptible, or the bacillus evolved to be less deadly, or something else?
A question that is asked by everyone who is obsessed with the Black Plague. And both things went on. We are in the decades where we think of viruses as producing pandemics, but back then, 14th century, it was in this case a bacillus, a bacteria, Yersinia pestis, and it laid waste to Europe, exactly as said. Best estimates are indeed a third to a half of people died in many parts of Europe. Good sense of what went on. London got hit by the plague. More than half of the people there died. And it took more than 200 years afterward for the population to catch up again, to get back to pre-plague levels, which, if I recall, was just in time for another great plague to hit London and wipe out, in this case, about a quarter of the population. Okay, so the Black Plague hit London, hit various places. It was remarkably destructive, but weirdly, there were a couple of good things that came out of it. For one thing, for a remarkable 6 years during the height of the plague, there was no war. England, focusing on England for the moment, England wasn't involved in a war for 6 years, which was kind of astonishing. The other good thing is it laid to waste so many people that there was a shortage of workers afterward. And for the first time ever, workers had some bargaining power because they were in such short supply. And this gave rise to increase in income, some degree of agitation against abuse by the landlords. But nonetheless, the overall picture was the Black Plague was a horror. And of course, it disproportionately killed the poor in London and in all the other cities because the wealthy all fled to their summer homes. And maybe atypically in this one, clergy got done in at an incredibly high rate because they stayed in the cities to take care of the poor. So, plague. One additional factoid or debunking a factoid, which I've always believed since my childhood, which was it was during the plague that kids started singing Ring Around the Rosie, Ashes, Ashes All Fall Down. And that's just a vicious, cruel urban myth. It did not get invented till many centuries afterward. Okay, so the question becomes twofold from Brian. Did humans develop resistance to the plague bacteria? And did the infectiousness, did the virulence of the bacteria itself change over time? And the answer is yes to both. First off, what you saw was not that humans, individual humans, evolved resistance to the bacteria, because it doesn't work that way, but instead, in the pre-plague population, there was a subset of individuals with the right gene variant. Actually, there's been a number of genes implicated, but the most clear one that's popped up is something called ERAP2, endoplasmic reticulum aminopeptidase 2. What does this do? It chops up proteins from the infectious bacteria inside immune cells and gives it to other immune cells, which now generate antibodies against it. And as it turned out, people with this mutation were really, really good at chopping this up and getting a really robust immune response, and they disproportionately survived. How can you tell this whole cottage industry now of exhuming corpses, skeletons from Black Plague cemeteries, and from just before that, and from just afterward, and looking at what was the incidence of this variant of this ERAP2 gene? What you saw was before, there was a certain amount of it. There was a lot more after, because that was a survival effect. It was people who had this genetic variant who disproportionately survived. So that was a great thing to do. And what you've seen over the century since is the percentage of the population in Europe that has this gene variant has increased, especially again after that follow-up plague in London in the 17th century, and selection for that. So that's great. That's great. Maybe we'll all have that variant someday. And as is so often the case, the upside of this is accompanied by a downside. If this gene variant produces a really jumpy, responsive immune system, it winds up increasing the chances of an autoimmune disease, in this case, Crohn's disease or rheumatoid arthritis. So, no free lunch as usual. You have a population that genetically has been selected over the centuries to be more resistant to the bubonic plague, but have more of a tendency towards autoimmune diseases. And we saw a similar story in our own lifetimes just a few decades back. There's a gene coding for something called a chemokine receptor. And a chemokine receptor is something in the immune system, and all that matters is there was a rare variant which made it impossible for HIV to get into an immune cell because it normally docked to this receptor and slipped in that way. So this is a theme lurking in a population when there's some horrific pandemic. A small percent of the population might have some gene variant that's going to get them through the selective bottleneck. Okay, so that gives us a sense of how humans have changed in response to the Black Plague and developed some resistance. How about changes in the bacteria itself? Has it changed over time? And that is absolutely the case. And this is a general theme. All sorts of pathogens, bacteria, viruses, etc., their infectivity, their virulence will change over time. And what we see these days is you still don't want to get the Black Plague, but it is a lot milder than it used to be. And what has this been about? Two different trends going on. The first one is a familiar one from looking at COVID, which is you wind up having the pathogen, the COVID virus, and then you get a defense against it. As it turned out, not a whole lot of natural genetic defenses lurking around in people, but defense in the form of those life-saving vaccines, which suddenly is winning the fight against COVID. And what we saw was soon after, a new COVID variant would come in, and we'd have to get a new vaccine, and we would have an arms race between pathogen and defense against pathogen. And this is something many episodes ago we discussed as a variant of what's called the Red Queen hypothesis. Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, yet another week in a row with Alice in Wonderland, the queen who has to run faster and faster to stay in the same place with these co-evolutionary arms races. Pathogen has to come up with something new. Immune defense trumps it. Back and forth, up they go. So that's one of the driving forces for a feature of a pathogen to change over time because the features of the defenses change over time. But the more pertinent thing here is a grand pattern that goes on with pathogens, which is they've got a tough problem which they have to optimize. Okay, pathogen, bacteria, parasites, virus gets into a host cell. And what that pathogen wants to do now is make lots and lots and lots of copies of itself to increase its reproductive success, to leave more copies of its genes in the next generation, and then burst out of the infected cell and find a way to get out of the body by way of sneezing or airborne or some such thing and passed on to next individuals. And that is a pathogen that's doing just great. It gets into a host, it replicates, and it gets out the other end. The problem, of course, becomes when the process of getting into host cells and taking over their replicative machinery and then bursting out and screws up the host, gives them a dreadful, dreadful disease. And thus, you've got the basic problem that a pathogen has to optimize, which is it wants to really infect the host and get a whole lot of new copies of itself made, but not kill the host so quickly that it doesn't get a chance to replicate and then be spread. So there's always this issue of balancing the virulence of an infective agent with transmissibility. Okay, so this has produced what was a pretty clear notion back when, 1904, this guy Theobald Smith, who is one of the founding fathers of parasitology at Rockefeller University. I spent my graduate career with a lab in a building named for him, which was horribly run down and has since been replaced. But Theobald Smith came up with what was called the avirulence hypothesis. You get some pathogen, and he was mostly thinking in terms of bacteria at the time. It comes in on the scene and it's damaging as hell, and it's facing this problem that it is killing the host way fast, where it's barely managing to pass on copies of itself. And what you then see is selection for the pathogen to become less damaging, to be less virulent, so that in the perfect world, according to this model, at some point you get this pathogen that isn't pathogenic at all. It isn't virulent. It isn't damaging. It just gets in there and makes copies of itself and spreads on, that you see a dramatic decrease in virulence while transmissibility still stays up there. That's the dream of every pathogen if it is inadvertently killing its host at too high of a rate. So, in that view, this is what happened with the bubonic plague bacteria. You had selection over time for decreased virulence. So that was that model. But then Theobald Smith was challenged 80, 90 years later by this guy, Robert May of Princeton and Harvard and Oxford, who eventually became Lord Robert May, which I thought was very charming since he was the son of a Northern Irish parent and a Scottish parent. So it's always sort of charming when you see the Queen having to knight somebody with that background. But he was a major figure in population genetics. And what he worked out mathematically was it doesn't quite work that way, because the Smith model is dependent on one assumption, that you could change virulence and change transmissibility independent of each other. In that perfect world for the pathogen, it gets rid of the virulence over time, so it's not sickening the host and it could stay there forever, but it's just as infective, just as transmissible. And what turns out is these pathogens are having to balance virulence with transmissibility because they're interconnected. The two of them can't be independent. And thus, what you see is there's an optimal level of virulence, not zero, not 100% killing your host, but there winds up being an optimal level there that gets the best possible combination of decreasing virulence and maintaining or increasing transmissibility. And this turns out to be the dominant model there. And as you can see, Robert May and Theobald Smith were not to be messed with. But the sense these days was that this model of optimizing, balancing the optimal point between these two interdependent variables in pathogens is what's actually going on. So the question then, of course, becomes what determines where in that 0% virulence, 100% virulence, where a particular pathogen winds up hitting its optimal point. And it's got to do with all sorts of variables. Is this a pathogen that is spread only from human to human? If it is, what's the population density of humans? And that turns out to tell you a lot about different characteristics of infectious diseases in the tropics versus in temperate zones. Temperate zones have higher population densities, so things bounce from person to person a lot faster. That's going to influence the optimal point. Next, what's the temperature like? Because higher temperature, transmissibility tends to go up. What's the humidity that has an impact on tropical optimal points versus temperate zone ones. But another factor is if you not only have human to human transmission, but you have transmission from animals, if this is a pathogen that started off in some other species and made the species jump into humans, or if it's coming from some other species by way of a vector like a mosquito, then you have to factor in transmissibility from the host species, the original one, or from the vector, the insect species, and that has to get factored in as well. Okay, so you factor in all these things, and what you get is with any pathogen over time, while the humans are tending to evolve resistance to it, the pathogen itself is evolving to be less damaging, but not all the way down to zero because there's an optimum point. And almost certainly that's what the COVID virus is still trying to find its equilibrium with in human populations. And let us hope we figure out how to upend that equilibrium.
Now, George from Alabama says, to follow up on the damaged joints predicting weather segment, I live on the Alabama coast of the Gulf of Mexico, all caps, and have worked as a nurse for over 30 years. I've had lots of experience in hospitals when hurricanes are looming nearby, and, as if synchronized, babies are born, mothers deliver like clockwork when the hurricane gets close. Is this due to the drop in barometric pressure? Could this be a different aspect of the same phenomenon?
Well, this takes us back to barometric pressure, part two now. Some episodes ago, talking about the very common experience that if one has an arthritic joint, an injured joint, when there's a drop of barometric pressure, when a storm is approaching, kind of gets achy. And what we saw is this is a real phenomenon. Barometric pressure, the air pressure on, among other things, your knee joints, your elbow joints, the synovial fluid in there, as the pressure decreases, the fluid expands outward, which makes it kind of achy. So we went over that. We also went over two total killjoy alternative possibilities. One was you actually feel more pain because you're not exercising because it's going to rain out there. And the other was, well, bad weather puts you in a bad mood, so you feel more sensitized to your pain. And both of those could be ruled out. And what we concluded there is the same phenomenon occurs when barometric pressure is dropping. Your bag of potato chips is going to bulge out a little bit. So you can use that as a barometer if you don't have a real one on hand. But what we see here now is the same exact phenomenon extended in another realm. Barometric pressure dropping. And if you are close to delivering more pressure, amniotic fluid on the membranes there, and weeks 30 to 40, the strength of the membrane are going way down, the stress put on them is going up. And that's precisely what you see. A number of publications showing you're more likely to go into premature labor, membranes rupturing, when there's a drop in barometric pressure. And I was shocked to see in one of these studies, there was a drop in barometric pressure in near-term pregnant women in the middle of, quote, bomb cyclones. And I can't believe that has happened to enough people that this could generate an entire publication. Something else that was surprising, when you look at the literature more closely, you see there's a bidirectionality. As barometric pressure drops, you are more likely to have premature labor, but also as barometric pressure rises from optimal point, you're about to have the same thing as well. And I don't understand how that one works, except we now are in our second question of the evening where you get an optimal point and a Goldilocks effect. So you've got barometric pressure influencing. Then it turns out there's other things that influence delivery time, likelihood of premature delivery, membranes rupturing. One of them is temperature, and a subtlety there. During the summer, as temperature gets hotter, you are more likely to have premature delivery. During the winter, if temperature happens to be getting hotter, you have less of a chance of premature delivery. So temperature dependent effect there. And then finally, I saw one paper talking about the effects of wind speed on the quality of free range turkey eggs. But then this takes us into a second whole domain where I had some of my biases having to be trashed, which was, ooh, lunar cycles have some effects on physiology, pregnancy related ones, delivery related. Lunar cycles, because it's well known the moon is exerting different gravitational forces at different times. And ooh, you're going to be having gravitational forces pulling your amniotic fluid upward and triggering premature delivery. And everybody has known for thousands of years that this is nonsense and this is an old wives' tale, except it turns out there's a little bit of evidence for this in humans. I saw one paper saying that there is a mild effect of lunar cycle on the likelihood of somebody having a stroke. And I mostly thought this was elegant. The paper was titled Moonstroke, making reference to an old movie with Cher and Nicolas Cage, Moonstruck. But what you also see is there's a little bit of evidence of lunar cycles affecting some aspects of delivery in humans. Where it's much more solid, though, is in animals. And studies of cows, dogs, cats, when the lunar cycle is such that the gravitational forces are exerting their greatest luring of amniotic fluid upward, in various animal species, that's where you're more likely to see premature delivery. And my guess is this has something to do with the difference between quadrupeds, all of those guys, and us bipedal humans. Why, for some reason, which should be obvious to somebody out there, but not to me, this effect is less impactful on bipedal organisms. So, amid that, you see all sorts of lunar cycle effects on animal reproduction. Artificial insemination of cows, Holstein cows, in fact, lunar cycles influencing the likelihood of it being a successful insemination. And I thought it was very interesting. This was a paper that had, among other co-authors, Temple Grandin, who's one of the world's experts on cow husbandry, and also someone who has had incredibly interesting, impactful effects with her being open about her autism. Then there's another study showing that lunar cycle during artificial insemination of cows is influencing whether it's an X sperm or a Y sperm that fertilizes, what the likelihood of conceiving a female or a male, that's altered by lunar cycle also. But then, best of all, there's a lunar cycle effect in a study of camels, domesticated camels, dromedary domesticated camels living in the Canary Islands for some reason, where, among other things, you discover that people in the business tend to call female dromedary camels she camels. And there's lunar cycle effects on she camels in the Canary Islands. So that's great. I thought that had covered the whole literature. But then I stumbled into a great study showing that barometric pressure, when barometric pressure is dropping, there's a slight increase in human brain volume. Some parts of the brain, yes, others no, but the net result is a slight increase, and it's a bigger effect in males, which the authors then revealed is the opposite of the direction of the effect of barometric pressure on brain size in female versus male tree shrews. Somebody had discovered that. So, what's the take home message here? Yep, I think it's the same phenomenon. Surprisingly, for other species, lunar cycles seem to have something to do with it. But that said, all of these are, no surprise, very small effects. So do not go out and buy an umbrella based on whether your she camel has gone into premature labor or not. These are really tiny effects.
Lastly, Camila from Argentina/Spain asks, is there such a thing as overusing the prefrontal cortex? What does it look like? What are the causes and consequences?
Great. Well, by now we've all been brainwashed. Prefrontal cortex is our friend. It is a good thing. What it does is it gives you self-discipline and gratification postponement and impulse control and emotion regulation and all these versions of doing the right thing, even if it's the harder thing. And we know that by now. You need your prefrontal cortex gearing up if your roommate is going out to get falling down drunk and you decide you got to work instead. Or if you're at a dinner and the dinner is appalling and somehow you find the means to tell the host, this was amazing. This was the greatest thing you've ever eaten. Or when you feel like murdering somebody, but you don't because your prefrontal cortex gets there in time. But then we have a whole realm where the prefrontal cortex might be very active, might be overactive in a way that winds up being deleterious. Here's one domain that comes to mind. Okay, it could take a whole lot of discipline to save the world and make the planet better and be Malala or Greta Thunberg, but it often takes a lot of discipline to pull off a genocide, to pull off an ethnic cleansing. Great example of that historically was Stalin. Stalin was a famously workaholic murderer, and Stalin had to show a whole lot of self-discipline, a whole lot of prefrontal activation to be able to focus down and successfully ethnically cleanse the Chechens and the Crimean Tatars and the Kurds and the doctors and the Jews and everybody else. So a very disciplined prefrontal cortex sometimes is exactly what's needed to pull off something appalling. Another domain is the very subtle, nuanced world of lying. Now, there's all sorts of realms where lying is fine. If you were an actor pretending to be a disgruntled, depressive Danish prince, you were saying lines that do not actually say what you were feeling. Okay, so that counts as lying. Or we get taught in an early age that if grandma brings you a toy that you already have, you lie to her. You say, oh, no, I don't have this. I don't have this. This is great. Thank you, grandma. Or writ large, we learn that it's a good thing when the Nazis are at your door asking you if you were sheltering refugees for you to say, nope, nope, not a one here. And of course, there's the scenario where a whole bunch of saintly clergy could be sitting around all evening playing a viciously competitive game of liar's dice. So that's all sorts of realms where it ranges from the benign to, in fact, a good thing. But then we have the realm of much more familiar lying, lying that is bad, lying that is damaging, lying that you want to avoid. And thus you get this paradox when somebody is tempted to do something awful, to steal, to backstab, to lie, when they are tempted to do it and they are trying to resist, they are activating their prefrontal cortex. It's taking a lot of work. But once they decide, what the hell, I'm going to give into temptation and I am going to lie, you then use your prefrontal cortex to do a good job at it because it's not easy. You've got to make sure you have the right amount of eye contact and you got to make sure your voice doesn't crack and you've got to keep track of what you've said already. And that could be a demanding task. The prefrontal cortex may be working very hard in good sociopaths. Okay, another a personality style called repressive personality, where by definition, this is someone who does not have a depressive disorder. They do not have an anxiety disorder. They're perfectly fine, mentally healthy. In fact, they're very successful. They're very productive. They're very regimented. They're very self-disciplined. These are individuals who can get themselves to work really hard. These are individuals who do not like surprises. They are very neophobic. This is someone who can tell you what they're having for lunch 3 weeks from Tuesday, and they're not very prone towards expressing emotion. They're not very good at reading emotion in other people. And these are people who are highly productive, highly successful. So what's the downside of this? Which is when something gets thrown at them, which is aversive and out of their control, they find this really, really aversive. What you see here is these are people who are working very hard, who are very stressed, producing a world in which something stressful never happens. And you see two physiological markers of this. They have elevated levels of glucocorticoids, the stress hormones, and you see elevated prefrontal cortical metabolic rates because they are squeezing their psychic sphincters 24/7 to keep in control, keep in control. And again, most of the time that makes for a much more impressive resume. But when things get out of your control, people with this sort of personality style are really thrown out of whack. But probably the most interesting realm where you see an overactive prefrontal cortex is in anorexia. Physiologically, metabolically, endocrinologically, anorexia is this totally bizarre thing because you've got all sorts of outposts in your body releasing hormones, releasing messengers that are saying, we're starving down here, eat, eat, eat. And what you see is an overriding top down signal that's telling the eat, eat, eat parts of your brain to pay no attention to those we're hungry hormone messengers, and instead to enhance signals of satiation. Ooh, I'm not really hungry. This is just fine. You have your body screaming at you to go eat, and you've got top down control in the brain saying, ignore them. This is just fine. You're doing fine. Don't eat. Don't eat. In fact, you're disgusted by the possibilities of eating. Where is this top down control coming from? Yeah, prefrontal cortex. In people with anorexia, highly elevated levels of prefrontal cortical metabolism, especially when dealing with temptations like pictures of food. Pictures of food, you see activation of these areas and thus immediate inhibition of reward related areas. I really don't want this. I really don't want this. I'm not hungry at all. This does not look appealing in the slightest. And what you see is an interesting opposite picture. Individuals with obesity, you show them pictures of appealing food, but not if you show them pictures of like broccoli or whatever, but show them appealing food pictures. And it's the exact opposite picture of people with anorexia. What happens then is prefrontal metabolism drops way down, activation of reward pathways go through the roof, and you are just being pulled towards that. So the prefrontal cortex tends to be hyperactive in people with anorexia, especially when they're dealing with those tempting food cues, attempting to squelch hunger. And that's a case where the pathology of this disease, this highly maladaptive, dangerous disease that has, in fact, the highest death rate of any psychiatric disorder, what you see is the ability of your brain to pay no attention to 100 million years of evolution saying, hungry, hungry, eat, eat. It's coming from top down regulation, pathological regulation from the prefrontal cortex. So I think that's the most striking realm where a highly active prefrontal cortex isn't such a hot idea.
That's all we've got. I'm Offspring Chair Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.